So what's up, people, and welcome to part 2 of our discussions with regards to the possible future for the Alita Battle Angel movie franchise. Will there be a sequel? And if so, what will the sequel contain based upon the scenes that we saw in the first movie, as well as the storyline that we know from the source material? So as mentioned in part 1, I wanted to make the topic for part 2 about Desty Nova. However, before I begin, I did want to give an update with regards to the most recent box office numbers for the movie. And as of the date of this video release, the worldwide box office numbers have finally cleared $350 million according to Box Office Mojo. And that is really good because of the fact that, if you recall, amongst all the discussions with regards to how much money this movie will have to bring in, or how much revenue this movie will have to bring in to greenlight a sequel, the low end was $350 million, whereas the high end was $500 million. Well, at least as of this date, this movie has cleared the low end. So that's pretty heartening to hear. And considering the fact that it's been out for quite a while now, and it's still bringing in a decent amount of money, with the domestic box office numbers finally reaching about $72 million, that there may still be a possibility that this movie will clear the $400 million mark, which will make it even more of a possibility that there will be a sequel. So let's be hopeful. I'm pretty happy because of the fact that I feel like I contributed, because I went to see the movie again for the third time this Friday. Yeah, I've seen it in IMAX 3D, I've seen it in regular 3D, and I've seen it in just regular standard movie. And I will have to say that if you're not really a fan of IMAX 3D or 3D movies in general, I found that the 2D, the non-3D movie or the standard movie is perfectly fine. I'm not really a fan of 3D movies. Now, one thing I will say is, considering I'm not a fan of 3D movies, it was actually very nice to see it in 3D. So if you are interested in, seeing the movie in 3D, I'd say go for it, But if you're the type that you don't feel that 3D is for you, then I think the standard movie was fine. And what was really nice is, of course, being able to see it a repeated number of times. I was starting to appreciate some of the smaller things that you missed the first time around. This time I noticed the music really well. And I finally realized why I got so emotional when I first saw Alita Woke Up. In the original time the first time I saw the movie, I thought it was because it was the first time I saw Alita, in the big screen. And that's definitely part of the reason. However, I finally realized that the music during that scene is absolutely fitting of that scene. The music is so beautiful at that point. And considering the fact that Rosa Salazar did a beautiful job of expressing the joy in Alita in waking up and realizing that she's alive, and that music fits so well, and man, that was a nice emotional scene. In any case, the recent numbers do feel like there is now a possibility that there may be a sequel, and considering the fact that there is such strong positive, feedback from the audience, rather than the critics, then maybe it might go. I'm not sure. I mean, the 500 million is still a long ways to go, and considering next week the behemoth that is Captain Marvel will be coming out. So yeah, I don't know how the box office numbers will continue to grow starting next week. But yeah, it's still hopeful, and we might as well stay hopeful, because I do want to see a sequel for this movie. And finally, I don't want to make this a long discussion with regards to this point, but I do want to bring up a point. In my last discussion, I talked about how some of the reviews with regards to this movie is being skewed. There was that discussion I talked about how, in the last weekends or the long weekends box office numbers, people were already saying it was a box office flop right around on a Friday before the long weekend started. And I was like, why? Why are you actually downplaying this movie? Well, this, as I kept on looking at more videos, this time I actually see the other side, where people are like, this movie's great, this movie's wonderful. Why aren't people more supportive of this movie? And then the person says, actually, I haven't watched this yet, but I've heard really good things about it. And I think people should support it. I'm like, what the heck, man? Why are you giving a review to a movie and supporting a movie that you haven't even watched yet? And then from what I see, if I continue to watch it, it's like they're using this as a tool to bash another movie, which I don't want to talk about here. But I'm like, I don't want to go into the politics of any of this pro or cons of what's going on. But what's saddening about this is I think this is a really good movie. And whether it's for the support or for against this movie, it's really sad to see when it starts becoming a vehicle for separate agendas that are going on. So yeah, I'm worried a little bit about that, in the sense that if the 20th Century Fox or Disney starts looking at this and realizing that this is a topic, or this movie is a topic that becomes a vehicle for a lot of these messages that are bashing each other with regards to alternate agendas, that alone may make people, the studios say, we don't want to make another movie. Why do we want to make another movie which will become a vehicle for all this debates that's going on, and this, passionate videos that come up that have nothing to do with the quality of the movie. So yeah, I'm hoping that doesn't become the case, because I do want to see a sequel for this. Okay, so that's about all I will say. Oh, one last thing. Yeah, I do want to thank Shoji Wars for this. I made the way I communicated how Rotten Tomatoes rates the movies, whether it's audience or it's critics, was in error for me. I mean, I do know how they do it. I just didn't communicate it properly. Although it's called ratings, or maybe it's called score there. It's really not really a rating per reviewer. It's actually the percentage of the number of people who actually give the movie a pass or a fail. So for example, in the audience score of 94%, it's not that the audience is giving it an average of 94% as a score, but it's actually saying that 94% of the audience is actually giving it a pass or a good mark versus a bad mark. So in the very end, it finally comes down to the same sort of thing. If you see a good score, it actually means that the overall audience, if it is favorable. If you see a bad score, it basically means that the overall audience is unfavorable for whatever reason that is, whether it's due to the quality of the movie, whether it's due to a secondary agenda. I'm not sure. But that was something that I did want to correct, and I thank Shoji Wars for noticing my error in the definition of how those scores are put out in Rotten Tomatoes. So thank you very much. Okay, so let's start talking about Desty Nova. Yeah, in the last video, I mentioned my concern with regards to how the movie portrayed Desty Nova, but it was actually quite nice to actually see him on screen. Of course, the one thing we do know is that Edward Norton will be playing Desty Nova, which may be a good thing, because I do find Edward Norton to be a very good actor. I've heard rumors that he's not the easiest actor to deal with. But on the other hand, I don't have to work with him, so I just have to watch his work. And you could see from his past films that he does a really good job in representing whatever part that he is supposed to be playing. So it'll be interesting, because of the fact that, as we know, Desty Nova is an extremely difficult character to portray. And eventually I'll be discussing, spoilers with regards to things that happen in the comic that are beyond what we see in the movie. But before I do that, I do want to give a definition, or my interpretation, I should say, of Desty Nova. Desty Nova is such a unique character that I think a lot of viewers or readers have different interpretations of what he is like. So I do want to give my interpretation because that may help clarify a lot of the reasoning that I may give with regards to some of the discussions that I'll be having. Also, with regards to this, as this is a movie/comic spoiler again, this is really here to open the discussions. My views may not be correct, but what I want to do is to open up this video or this episode so that people can have discussions with regards to how they feel about Desty Nova and his representation in the movie. I do want to thank people for the first part because there was a lot of interesting information that came out with regards to the topics that I covered there. And I appreciate everybody who gave their input. And yeah, please keep on going with that because I find these discussions to be quite interesting. Okay, so for my interpretation of Desty Nova, I did mention in the part 1 that I find him more anarchist than a dictator. And that he loves to burn empires down rather than create them. And the reason I find it that way is he is somewhat a counterculture sort of person. And the reason for that is, unlike a lot of rebels who want to fight culture, it's not really that way. It's just that he's such a unique character and has a unique viewpoint for stuff that he naturally becomes counterculture. The bottom line is he doesn't really care what his actions does to the consequences to society. He wants to do stuff and he won't let anything get in the way of getting those stuff done. And because of that, he naturally tends to fall towards the anarchist/counterculture persona rather than the dictator/political agenda sort of persona. So if I were to compare him to other antagonists, I would say he would be, again, closer to someone like the Joker. If you've read Tokyo Ghoul, the comic, he would be like the clowns in there, or he would be, again, like Hannibal Lecter. And that would be different than somebody like Emperor Palpatine in Star Wars, or the Kingpin, for example, in Spider-Man, or that Donald Sutherland character. I forgot what his name was in Hunger Games, He is the other type. He just basically is a lone wolf because of the fact that the actions that he does tends to eventually go against society, and to him it doesn't really matter. Now, if you compare him with, the other anarchist type of antagonists, such as the Joker or the clowns, he does have a separate persona, which is quite unique. So, in Joker's case, he creates chaos, he creates terror because of the fact that it's actually quite enjoyable. He lives for that sort of passion. He actually does love burning empires down. It's his passion, and the thing I loved about Heath Ledger's version of Joker in The Dark Knight was he basically let society create its own destruction, right? I mean, he would set up situations where then people in that society would have to make choices that would eventually, create the destruction of that society, and so that time when, he gave that choice for Batman to do. Does he want to save the mayor or does he want to save his fiance? That was the perfect way I would see Joker, because he does create these situations that let the person who is the victim actually decide their own downfall. It's a lost situation sort of thing, and he absolutely loves that sort of situation. Now, for the clowns, it's a little bit different. For them, they feel that they're actually doing a benefit to society to actually create the terror and the destruction around them. To them, they feel that, if people are too happy and too peaceful, then they lose the purpose of living. They don't appreciate life anymore. And the best way to appreciate life for the clowns is for people to realize when they're in ultimate terror and the ultimate point of death is only the time when they start appreciating life. So for the clowns, it's almost like a gift to society that they want to give and be a useful entity by creating this terror so that society will actually start appreciating life a lot more. But in Nova's case, he does it, from my perspective anyway, he does it because he is a scientist. And the terrifying thing about him is not that he enjoys it the way Joker does, or he thinks it's kind of a spiritual thing, although there's a little bit of that, the way the clowns do. But he does it because he wants to be educated. He wants to be enlightened. And that makes him an extremely terrifying person. Now, if you think about it, saying he's a scientist and he wants to be educated sounds really boring. Like, what's so terrifying about that? But what you don't realize, for people who don't know Nova, what you don't realize is it's terrifying because of the fact that he considers the rest of the world as his laboratory, his experiment. And everybody in that society is no different than a bunch of bacteria in a petri dish. And just like a bunch of scientists will have no conscience in annihilating that entire, bacterial strain, he has no problem annihilating an entire society just to get a little bit of knowledge out of it, or a lot of knowledge out of it. And so he's the ultimate mad scientist. He comes up with these things that he wants to learn. And if it requires the complete annihilation of people, then he will do it just because he feels that the learning is the most important. And since he's batshit crazy, he's not going to come up with these really peaceful experiments. He always comes up with the wackiest experiments that comes out. So, for example, one day he might come up with the question, I wonder, how far the human psyche can endure pain and trauma. And he'll try to experiment by taking a subject, skinning them alive and then rubbing salt into their wounds. And what's scarier for him than other political, dictators that might do the same thing is because this is an experiment, there's nothing the subject can do to stop that experiment. He'll continue to do that. And if, for example, the subject passes out because of the sheer excruciating pain, he'll just bring them back to consciousness again and continue the experiment for days, weeks, months of that person feeling excruciating pain just to see the psyche break down. And even if that guy dies, Nova is brilliant enough that he could actually resurrect that person again and say, no, you're not allowed to die to stop this experiment. We got to see when your psyche will actually continuously break down and go to an ultimate breaking point, and I won't let you die to stop this experiment. That's the type of experiments he does, and that's why this guy is so absolutely terrifying. But now, when I see Nova in Alita Battle Angel, I get a different picture of him. I get more the dictator type, like Emperor Palpatine or that Donald Sutherland character in Hunger Games than I do the Joker. And what disturbs me is not only is this, for me, a misrepresentation of Nova, but it changes the way the world is, because the world is somewhat then dictated by this dictator, which is not the world that I want to see. I mean, it just then simplifies the entire situation. I mean, one of the things that I really liked about the comic Battle Angel Alita is it never really personified the antagonist or the evil entity or the corruption into one single person, group, society, whatever. But in general, what I loved about this world was that the good and the corruption was to some extent everywhere, right? I mean, whether it was in Iron City, it wasn't just Vector, it wasn't just Gruishka. There was just a whole lot of corruption that was going on, and to some extent a whole lot of good, just like in society. It's not just one criminal, and it's not like a group of criminals all ganging together. There was a bunch of corruption that was going on independently all over the place. And the nice thing about Battle Angel Alita was, for example, even with Nova, regardless of whether Nova was there, corruption still continued to exist. As strong as Nova was and as corrupt as he was and as much terror as he created, even if you took him out of the equation, the corruption would continue. And that was something that was really well represented in the story. But it's really not well represented in the movie, in the sense that there is this hierarchy, right? It's, it goes from Grishka to Vector, from Vector to Nova, and it keeps on going up, and everything seems to right now be focused towards Nova. And so, yeah, I want to talk about that further but I will give a spoiler alert at this point. I will be diving more and more into the comic and the future discussions of what happens in the story beyond the movie into the comic story. And so if you've seen the movie but don't want to be spoiled on how Nova may change the storyline in the future, then I would suggest that you stop the video at this point. And I thank anybody who've watched the video up to this point, and appreciate your consideration that we will be discussing spoiler discussions from this point on. Okay, so with regards to the movie, there were several scenes in which Nova came out, either just in voice or in full character. The first time you saw him in Grishka, when he was talking about Alita and the battles, the images of the battles he saw from Grishka's brain, and indicated that she was a Panzerkunst practitioner and asked to have her killed and have her heart delivered to him. Immediately after that, of course, Vector turned into Nova and offered Chiren the chance to go up to Zalem if she worked with him. And then later on, of course, the next time was again with Vector when he was saying he was disappointed in Grishka for losing the battle. And finally, of course, is when we see him once again with Vector talking to Alita himself. And that discussion was actually one of the more interesting ones, because one of the things I remember him saying was he was actually quite impressed in how far Alita has gone, and she actually exceeded his expectations, which isn't something that, of course, antagonist says to a protagonist, but it's perfectly in line with what Nova would say to Alita, because as we know, in Battle Angel Alita, Nova was never a hateful antagonist to Alita. He always was a major fan of Alita. And one of the things that's interesting about Nova is the most terrifying thing that could happen to you is if you actually got the affection of Nova, right? I mean, the guy is basically a cold-hearted person, so he doesn't have any emotions, but he does have curiosity. And the only time he has affection for you is when he's curious about you and he wants to do some interesting experiments based upon the research of that subject. And so, one of the things that he always found to be interesting about Alita is she is a survivor. She can survive through tremendous amounts of trauma. And so, of course, naturally, Nova is like, oh, this is interesting. Let's see how much trauma we could put on this person. And he does that as basically a fan of Alita, hoping that Alita would somehow triumph over that so that he could continue on with the experimentation. I mean, what we know in the future is, of course, half the time he's saving Alita's life. And in the beginning, I was like, "Oh, he's befriending Alita," but in reality, it's like, no, he's kind of making sure that she comes back to life, so that he could experiment on her again and see how far she will go based upon the trauma. I mean, even the Imaginos body that he eventually gives to her is under the assumption that she is one of the best fighters out there, and so why not give her the best body and then just see just how far she can go? You know, that's the type of interest that Nova has. And so that statement of, whoa, you exceeded my expectations, which is basically fanboying over Alita, is exactly what I would have expected Nova to say. Now, with that said, I'm still having issues with regards to Nova being up in Zalem, because he, of course, was not up in Zalem in the comics. He was basically down in Scrapyard City all this time. He was an exile of Zalem, just like Ido and Chiren was. But in his case, he didn't care. I mean, again, he's counterculture. It doesn't matter to him where he is. Unlike other people who are like, oh, I feel rejected because I was exiled from the upper wonderful city of Zalem. He doesn't care. So long as he has his ability to experiment, he will be happy to experiment in Scrapyard City. He will be happy to experiment in Zalem. And he has the ability to do so, right? I mean, he is one of the best hackers out there. So if he needed to, yeah, he probably could find a way to get up to Zalem. But in any case, being up there is not as problematic as, again, him seeming to be in control of a lot of power up in Zalem. Once again, I always found the Nova character to be the character that goes against what you might call the system, right? He's counterculture. He goes against the system, and his character's there in the comic to do so, right? They create the world, and then they throw him in to destroy the world, right? So him being the world creator, for me, has its difficulty. And although the movie did not specifically say that he was the ruler of Zalem, there are a few things that indicate that at least he has a significant amount of power up there. The first is, of course, the fact that he has this network, right? All these people working under him. And Vector seems to be a network, a connection, Black Market's connection that goes all the way up to Zalem, and yet he's completely in servitude of Nova. In the comic, there was no real connection between Nova and Vector was the Black Market's dealer that that was in servitude to Zalem, the mysterious city of Zalem, and all the, entities that controlled that. But that wasn't particularly Nova, and Nova was basically the entity that was doing whatever it was and kind of, getting sometimes in the way of Zalem and potentially becoming also an interest to Zalem. And so now him being up there does make it, once again, this Hunger Games divergent sort of, I am the ruler, and now I am also the big bad that you have to go after. No, I mean... Alita does go after him, but not because she wants to overthrow the tyranny of Zalem, but basically because she has some personal issues that she needed to deal with Nova, right? And in fact, Zalem kind of got so interested in Nova that using Alita as a tuned agent, asked Alita to go after Nova, right? But the biggest problem I saw was the final scene where Nova came out. Well, not the final scene, but the one last scene I haven't talked about where Nova came out, which was the one in the flashback between Gelda and Alita, right? I mean, that was a flashback of a battle practice that was going on. And that was basically 300 years prior, at least, when she was still practicing under Gelda, and Nova's image came out. And the problem with that is then, Gelda was like, remember who we're going after, and Nova's image comes out, and she's like, I can't remember the exact statement, but she was like talking to him as he was the dragon of whatever, indicating that once again he was so powerful and so famous that even the Künstlers, the Panzerkunst practitioners, had a target on them. And in the comic, the whole point, again, coming back to why I said the world was way beyond Nova was notorious within his own little world. And wherever he influenced things, yes, he was pretty well known. But once you get out into an area like Mars, they could care less about Nova. I mean, Mars has its own set of problems. Mars is a completely dysfunctional society. That place makes Scrapyard City look like a dream, right? I mean, the things we've seen in Mars Chronicle makes your blood cold, you know? But yeah, so the Kunstlers should have no real interest in Nova, and they never indicated for the small little times where Kunstlers appear, they never ever indicated that Nova was ever something that they were interested in, you know, a person that they were interested in. That is rightfully so. You know, neither is the Republic of Venus or the Republic of Jupiter ever interested in Nova. And the only person who might have a mild interest in Nova was Embody, right? And he wanted to, you know, somehow get Nova underneath him, and eventually, to some extent, does when he gets Supernova. But here, you know, in the flashback, you know, Gelda is telling Alita that her main purpose is to go after Nova. That's the important thing. And then later on, when they have the flashback of them climbing up that tube, you know, and the tube breaks, Gelda says, you know, remain focused on your mission. Go destroy Zalem. So Zalem is the target and Nova is the target, indicating that, once again, Nova is so powerful that the only way to go after him is to destroy Zalem, right? It's not like he is just one entity in Zalem. You have to destroy the entire city of Zalem to be able to get them down. Now, that may not be the case because of the fact that, as they said, you know, this entire raid was done in all of the Sky Cities, and they took them all down. So maybe the Nova character and the Zalem target are separate. But it still is very interesting that during that entire fight scene, why the heck would they even bring Nova's image up, raising him to a much higher status than he was in the source material? And that's quite concerning. Now, one possibility may be that he may be in Zalem, and that may be Nova up in Zalem. But it may not be the Nova up in Zalem. It just may be a Nova up in Zalem. And I want to thank a lot of you commenters with regards to this discussion, because I found this quite interesting. Yes, it just may be Nova. But as we know, you know, Nova can be everywhere. And the interesting thing with regards to this movie was that they created this communication link that gave Nova the ability to mind hack or mind communicate into other entities. And so, as we know in the source material, one of the reasons why he's considered immortal is because he can create multiple versions of himself that are all over the place. It's really hard to know whether you've actually killed Nova, because there's so many of him everywhere. They're everywhere. There's multiple human versions of him. He pops up on the screen to terrorize you in computer form. You know, he's just everywhere. So maybe the one that we saw in Zalem is Nova, but it just may be a Nova, and it may not be the Nova. You know, it just may be even just a non-character who's being controlled by Nova, just like Vector was, except that this guy is kind of pretending to be Nova. Or maybe he is Nova. Maybe there is a Nova up in Zalem for this movie, and there still is a Nova down in Scrapyard City. And if that's the case, I will find that really good. And they're all mind-linked with this mind link that the movie brings out, which I thought was quite interesting. If you mind-link all the Novas, that would be a terrifying idea. Yeah. Multiple Novas, just all mind-linked to each other. That would be kind of crazy. And that would be an interesting difference. I would actually accept that and find that quite interesting for the movie. But in any case, yeah. For example, if the next sequel turns out to be the Zapan arc, then we all know that we will need to have Nova down on the surface. So maybe there will be a Nova up in Zalem, and there will be a Nova down on the surface. And what will be interesting is if Nova, for example, controlled other people, and the Nova that you see down on the surface was represented by somebody who was mind hacked by Nova, and then that created the entire Zapan arc. And then, of course, eventually, somehow, Alita gets to Zalem. and meets with Nova, maybe even defeats this Nova, then later on finds out that's not even the Nova that was the true antagonist Nova, right? So then there's a continuation, even after the trilogy, of potentially, extending this further because, hey, you never know if you've ever killed Nova completely. And that would be a very interesting thing to see. Now, one last thing, I'll mention it here, although it's a little bit off topic. There was one interesting thing with regards to the story, which I have to thank Geraldine L. and Brian Cairns, and also I think Shoji Wars was discussing this as well. There was one specific scene at the very end, which originally I was so appalled with the way Chiren's props looked, that how cheap they looked, that something went completely over my head until they mentioned it, that there's a specific organ in Chiren's body that shouldn't be there, but is in that, is in that display. And I was like, I was looking at it again, and I was like, yeah, you're absolutely right. And that changes, again, the storyline and simplifies the storyline, indicating that there may be a lot of changes that will simplify the whole world building once again. Now, originally, I thought that it may have been a mistake, and they just happened to have that organ in there accidentally. But if you watch that scene closely, Vector actually mentioned and describes that specific organ in his speech, which indicates that this wasn't something that they accidentally put in the props and the editors didn't notice it to cut it out. But it actually is mentioned as a dialogue, which indicates that they purposely had that in there, which indicates that they are changing the way they are making this world. And that is a major, major change to Zalem. I presume every comic reader who has gone through the original series knows what I'm talking about, because it's a very significant scene. And why I bring it up here is it's a scene that actually will be kind of revealed by Nova. But if that organ is in Chiren's body, then it indicates that there is nothing for Nova to reveal. And that will be interesting to see how the producers move forward with that, if there's going to be a sequel. Anyway, that's about it for this episode. Thank you very much again for watching. I appreciate you watching all the way to the end. Considering how long these videos are becoming, I apologize for me rambling on. As you can imagine, I don't make scripts and I just talk off the top of my head. I apologize for that. But in any case, there's a lot more things that I still want to talk about. Probably in the next one, I'll talk a little bit about Motorball. And we'll continue on with this. I don't know if we'll ever get a sequel. And if it doesn't, then I may still continue to talk about this as a discussion point. A discussion series for people who are fans of Battle Angel Alita. And discuss certain areas that you may want to talk about in the comment section. So once again, I will leave the comment section open for anybody who wants to talk about anything, even all the way up into the Mars Chronicle, where we're finally, starting to get some really exciting stuff. So I'm looking forward to that. But in any case, I hope they make a sequel. And I hope they remain faithful to the storyline overall. But I am worried in both cases whether they will be able to get to the point where they can get a green light to make a sequel. And if they do, will they be faithful? What I'm really worried about is this. Battle Angel Alita is such a non-mainstream storyline, which is why I like it. It doesn't have the cliche mainstream tropes, but because it's such non-mainstream, and you already can see criticisms about even the first movie of non-mainstream topics, where the critics basically were like, well, blah, 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 which basically was stating the bottom line, it's not mainstream enough, and that's what I like is mainstream stuff, and this one's so far off mainstream, I'm going to criticize about it. It's kind of the feeling I got in a lot of the criticisms that were out there. And if that's the case, then maybe the studios will say, okay, we'll greenlight a next movie, but please make sure that it becomes mainstream to the topics and the the agendas that all these people want to go with the movie, which will ruin the movie, I think. I mean, the storyline, in my opinion. But in any case, we can worry about that if that ever happens. But I will continue on with these episodes, and I hope you join us at that time. But thank you very much for watching. And until the next episode, happy anime watching, happy comic reading, happy movie watching. And as always, Jaya, nice day, everyone.